Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we're on is the ceded traditional homeland of the Puyallup Nations. And then I'd also like to acknowledge my research mentor, Dr. Ezra Zeitler, is also in the audience, so he's been a big part of this project. So this is a research-heavy presentation. I'll warn you with that to begin. But start off with discussing some of the considerations that went into our research questions, some past studies we looked at during our literature review, talk about the methodology of the content analysis, and then what we found. Then I'll also talk a little bit about the most recent map that just came out in May, and then talk about some next steps that we're thinking about for this project. So I guess the big question here is, why study state highway maps? It's a good one, but overall the maps themselves and their graphics, the graphics-filled backsides are a really good indicator of the state in the time period they were produced, as they reflect values and serve as tourism information. Since the mid-1930s, highway maps distributed by the state of Minnesota have become more detailed and comprehensive while integrating themes reflecting aspects of the state's diverse economic activities. Our study identified the themes emphasized in Minnesota state highway maps, how they've changed over the past century, and how these themes highlight overall representation of how the state paints itself. So our main research question here was to look at how graphic representations of society have changed over time in Minnesota's official highway maps. We wanted to create a holistic overview and took a few different aspects into account. We looked at how gender and race were portrayed in the maps, as well as looking at how the environment and economy were presented both in conjunction with each other and as separate entities. So start off with our literature review. We categorized it into two parts, the past state highway map research and then feminist geographies. So although published research on state highway maps has been few and far between, especially in recent years, paper state highway maps have been a staple of the American driving experience since the early 1900s, when the highway system was introduced. Some states have been printing maps since the inception of the US federal highway system in 1916, with the state of Minnesota joining the map game in 1920. These maps have been relied upon by generations of Americans to navigate the country by car. The maps do rely on some level of standardization within states, but almost no standardization between states for style or cartographic process. The process of creating the maps has been virtually the same since their inception, save for a transition to digital production when it became relevant with GIS. To keep paper state highway maps relevant, it's important to understand how they're used by the driver to navigate. While the obvious use of the maps is for basic navigation, states have also taken advantage of the ubiquitous nature of these maps to employ them as promotional tools for the interests of the state government by devoting a portion of the map's backsides for photos and text. In a 1994 article published in Cartographic Perspectives, Mark H. Bockenhauer identifies three dominant cultures influencing this promotional material: the culture of transportation and modernization, the culture of promotion, and the culture of domination. All of these can be seen throughout the years in the Minnesota State Highway Map, and it becomes apparent that these maps are not only for navigation, but also serve as an educational tool for drivers and an increasingly promotional tool for the state. To look at feminist geographies in relation to this promotional information, we look to Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's work on feminist data visualization. Feminist geography focuses on representation and the inequalities within it, as well as the emotions that come with these representations. Feminist geographers are often criticized for the subjectivity that many objective scientists say can hinder true scientific progress. When it comes to spatial representation, human beings are often represented as points on a map and quantifiable objects, completely disconnecting people from geographic phenomena that is inherently human-related. However, representation in maps should not discount emotions and should strive to be human-centered. Because of the disconnect between researchers and their subjects and the objectivity and lack of reflexivity within scientific research, mapping has always exhibited a masculine tone. Cartographic perspectives have typically been presented by individuals and institutions in positions of power. Feminist cartography has changed the way people are represented by incorporating different considerations of power, context, and pluralism to mapping. This can connect back to the culture of domination that Bockenhauer identified in state highway maps. His study was done in 1994, but even then, geographers were taking time to examine power and dynamics within maps without explicitly calling it feminist geography. And finally, although feminist geography and its role in cartography has highlighted gender inequalities in institutions and society, of course it's about more than gender equality. Feminist theory also focuses on inequalities of race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, and more in order to create representations of how these marginalized groups experience the world and how power structures in society shape these experiences. So when it came time to start our project, we were excited to find out that the state of Minnesota publishes the Minnesota Reflections Library, which includes an online repository of high-quality scans of every single Minnesota state highway map that's ever been published. This made our jobs a whole lot easier, as we were able to view all the maps we needed online and didn't need to brave a Minnesota January blizzard to get to the map library. When choosing maps to include in our content analysis, we knew that trying to analyze close to 100 maps would be too much for the scope of our research timeline, so we chose 11 maps we thought represented the years well. We chose these maps by starting with the first one we could, 1936, because it was the first with that backside promotional material, and then looking at the map covers to choose ones that represented thematic changes over the years well. From the sampled maps, a preliminary content analysis was performed to inform the more in-depth study. We performed a manifest content analysis on 117 total images across 11 different maps to quantitatively assess the visible content of the map's backsides. We collected much more data than I have time to present here, so it'll be more of a look at overall themes. The design of our analysis was informed by work on visual content analysis that's been done by Megan Kelly. When designing our analysis, we used a feminist lens to focus the categories and kept in mind the principles of feminist data visualization. All three of us working on the project performed an analysis of each map to ensure continuity and consensus in the responses. Numerous aspects of the visual elements of the map were coded as part of the manifest content analysis. Categories used to classify the imagery, some of them listed up here, were included themes relating to natural amenities, urban amenities, economic activities, or transportation. Imagery was also assessed for its relative and absolute location, seasons represented, land cover, and characteristics of people in the photos, including age, race, and sex. So, overall, this analysis of thematic imagery in the 11 sampled maps reveals a continued emphasis on Minnesota's natural amenities since 1936 that varied in intensity as the state's road network developed and the Twin Cities rose in national prominence. The presentation of women as passive participants in tourism activities, problematic representation of the state's indigenous peoples is exemplified here by the official seal of the state of Minnesota, an overrepresentation of white men, women, and children without physical disabilities, and a lack of people of color and inclusionary symbols of LGBTQ people. Our content analysis revealed that the most popular image location was the Boundary Waters and the Northwoods of Minnesota, followed by the Mississippi River and the Twin Cities. The most popular economic activities were tourism and transportation infrastructure, with a few mentions of forestry, mining, and agriculture. The maps began in the 1930s with a heavy emphasis on tourism and the up-north lifestyle, but slowly transitioned to promote urban cultural centers, infrastructure improvements, and economic activities. During the years that outdoor recreation was heavily represented, there was a focus on active outdoor activities and showing people getting active and using natural resources for their enjoyment. While there was some representation of quiet and restful recreation, most notably highlighting relaxing women rather than men, the emphasis was on active recreation such as fishing, canoeing, and motorsports. This can serve to highlight the state's interest in health and active pursuits, which is a positive representation. However, the emphasis of these active outdoor pursuits historically was skewed heavily towards masculine representation, with hardly any emphasis of females participating in stereotypically male activities. With time, the maps began to emphasize transportation, urban cultural amenities, and economic development more than the natural landscape, emphasized by the first few maps in the sample. The increased advertising of urban spaces and activities available around the state can be linked to the expansion of highways throughout the 20th century. As more roads were constructed, people from around Minnesota and surrounding states were given extended opportunities to explore tourist attractions and urban settings throughout the state. This is also around the time that the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, were booming. The population was growing rapidly, Fortune 500 companies were expanding, and of course, Prince was doing his part to advertise the cities as the place to be. This is representative of the results of the analysis, as representation of the tourism industry based in urban centers has increased over the last 4 decades. So looking at nature's representation in Minnesota state highway maps, it's fluctuated over the years, being the focus of the maps one decade and pushed aside in favor of infrastructure the next. This represents a changing focus of the Minnesota Tourism Department, as well as societal ideals in general changing throughout the decades. The impacts of World War II can be seen clearly in the 1942 map, with blatant American propaganda, but nature's role was represented more subtly. Rather than touting recreation in Minnesota during the war, the state's natural mineral resources of the Iron Range were advertised as being nature's richest bounty and highly important to the war effort, and in this way, even nature herself could contribute to winning the war. The 1949 map celebrated Minnesota's centennial with a full-page spread on the early voyagers and settlers to the territory, portraits of the white male founders of the Twin Cities, and information highlighting industry and economy in the state, with the only indigenous representation being indigenous folks walking westward with horses. With the passage of the Wilderness Act of 1964, nature maintained a starring role on the maps, and nature-based recreation was highlighted again, while still incorporating the infrastructure of the state parks as an economic asset. The new interstate highway systems and the Mayo Clinic were also heavily featured in these years, which is a stark juxtaposition to the wilderness focus. The consumerism of the 1980s and 90s is well represented with a map that highlights urban areas and economic features such as the Mall of America and a statewide Olympic festival, as well as new road systems and easier transportation options for the state's residents. The environment and nature fell out of the spotlight in favor of highlighting the urban areas and amenities, but was back in the next decades and remains a focus in today's maps. So finally, to look at representation, based on the results of the content analysis, a few patterns can be seen over the decades that were analyzed. Arguably, the most notable pattern is the lack of representation of individuals who do not fall into the heterosexual white male category. Women, people of color, disabled individuals, and folks in the LGBTQ community comprise a very small or non-existent amount of representation in map content between 1936 and 2009. In the earlier decades represented in the sample, men are often portrayed as rugged and masculine as they hone their wilderness skills in the great outdoors. Women, on the other hand, are shown inactive and lounging by the lake. By later decades included in the sample, imagery does become more inclusive by showing women participating in activities like swimming, running, and sledding. Still, there are maps that do not contain representation of women at all. Although this transition may appear to be reflective of how far women's rights have come since 1936, the representations present on these maps continue to be overwhelmingly masculine, which begs the question of whether men or women are the designers and producers of these maps. The sample of 11 maps included a very little representation of people of color. When present, many images of people of color included indigenous people. These images were always paired with captions or supplementary graphics that indicated the history behind the indigenous imagery. Rarely are the specific tribes of the indigenous subjects of these photos referred to, though some maps do include languages in the captions. Other people of color represented, and you can literally count them on one hand, include an African-American man playing a saxophone, an African-American child smiling and playing, and an African-American woman running with two other women. This is the representation that exists in the state highway maps, while overall about 20% of Minnesota's actual population identifies as a person of color. A complete lack of obvious representation of LGBTQ people and those with disabilities, as well as the minimal representation of people of color, brings into question the demographics of the creators of the maps and plurality. Are the cartographers responsible for these official state highway maps representative of the population? And how does this representation impact perceptions of Minnesota? So moving into the 2019 map, it was released in May of this year, so it wasn't included in our original study. We were excited to find some changes in the representation portrayed in the maps. For example, the 2019 map effectively doubles the number of people of color discernibly represented in the maps included in our study. While the imagery on this edition of the map still places an emphasis on the natural value of Minnesota, there's a more holistic presentation of everything the rest of the state has to offer, including art museums, music icons, food and drink, and family entertainment. The large featured photo highlights Loon Lake in the North Shore of Minnesota, while the cover photo shows a teepee available to rent at Blue Mound State Park in the southwest corner of the state. The rest of the images highlight arts, culture, shopping, and other uniquely Minnesotan happenings like Prince and Tater Tot Hot Dish. This increased representation considers the experiences of many different groups of Minnesotans and shows that there might be someone new on the design team. So next steps in the project, we're actually going to flip the maps over and focus a content analysis on the maps themselves to investigate the cartography and content of the navigational roadmap. We'd like to take a look at how the maps were designed, but also what sorts of information and resources were included, particularly at how the maps can be useful for underrepresented groups such as low income and immigrant populations who are non-English speaking and or new to the state. We hope to reach out to Explore Minnesota and the Department of Transportation to discuss how the maps are produced and the process of content selection. Our main goal for this project is to create a new Minnesota State Highway map or an alternative Minnesota State Highway map. Reintroducing cartographic themes and designs from the past would elevate the looks of the maps, but also adding information and services and deciding what needs to be represented is a goal. Finding a way to include more than only the current target demographic of middle to upper class residents with vehicles and disposable incomes will be a focus. How can the state highway map benefit other populations, and how can it remain useful and relevant with the digital and technological advances of today? So thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for the map scans, and then the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, Department of Geography for supporting the research, and the NACIS Student Travel Award for allowing me to come here today. Thank you guys so much for listening.